27th of January 2015, and I'm very privileged to be able to welcome to the programme Dr. Daniele Ganser, who is author of the seminal book NATO's Secret Armies, Operation Gladio, and Terrorism in Western Europe. Now, Dr. Ganser is a Swiss historian specialising in contemporary history since 1945 and international politics, whose research centres in peace studies, geostrategy, covert warfare, resource wars and economic policy. He teaches at the University of St. Gallen and the University of Basel, and is also founder and director of the Swiss Institute for Peace and Energy Research, which is also in Basel. Dr. Ganser, thank you very much indeed for joining us on The Mind Renewed.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's great to be speaking to you at long last. I've given really very cryptic information about you in my little opening remark there, so I'm just wondering if you could just give us a fuller impression of the work that you do.
Yes, I mean, the information that you provided is correct. I'm here in Switzerland. I'm 42 years old. I have 2 kids. And what I do is I research secret warfare. I look at resource wars. I look at special operation forces. I look at the secret services. And I'm interested in peace research. I'm interested in human rights. So, an activist academic, as you call them, academics with a clear feeling that it's not right, that we are stuck in the spiral of violence, that we actually are.
Yeah. And of course, we're going to be discussing the specific issue of Operation Gladio, as it's normally called. Obviously, we're going to be centering in your research that led up to your book, NATO's Secret Armies. Now, I understand that your book really was based on your PhD studies. So what prompted you to get interested in this subject in the first place?
I did my studies here in Switzerland, and my first book, that was before the PhD. We had to do a master thesis. Every student of history here in Switzerland, and I guess it's the same all over the world, has to search for a topic for his master thesis. And what I did at that time was I looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I looked at the CIA and the Bay of Pigs invasion. So that was in the 1960s when the Americans tried to overthrow Fidel Castro. And that was really fascinating because during my time in Swiss high schools, we never learned anything of secret warfare. Our history teachers never told us anything. And then I went through my university degrees and I never heard anything about secret warfare. And then just at the end of my studies, doing my master, I learned about secret warfare, that secret services exist, that at United Nations in the Security Council, governments lie to each other and how it all works. And I was baffled. I was 25 years old then, and I thought, this is interesting. I want to know more.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting because we're sort of brought up to have faith in our governments. I think we can kind of understand that, but along with that goes this kind of assumption that, well, they would never lie to us.
That's right. It's really funny. In April 1961, the CIA was doing the invasion of Cuba, and it was obviously a secret operation. It was the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the aim of the CIA was to topple the government of Fidel Castro. That was part of my historic research. I looked at the documents of the United Nations Security Council. And the funny thing is, obviously, you have the standing members, France and England and the US and Russia and China. These are the 5 standing members in the UN Security Council. And you have the Cuban representative who comes in and says, we're just being attacked by the CIA and, they're trying to overthrow the government. And then you look in the official transcripts and the American ambassador says, this is all nonsense. This is probably some fake information. And then the Cuban representative goes on and says, no, we are being bombed right now. It's not fake. And then the American ambassador says, oh, yeah, true indeed, you're being bombed. But that probably, as I've heard now through my channels, are people from the Cuban Air Force, pilots, who are so dissatisfied with this dictatorship of your Fidel Castro that before leaving Cuba, they decided to drop some bombs on the country they wanted to leave. Right. It is hilarious, but that's actually in the records. And the funny thing is, then the British and the French ambassador in the UN say, oh, if my colleague from the US said this, then that's probably true. And we believe him totally, completely. and the Chinese and the Soviets go completely mad and say, oh, it's all nonsense. And so, that was basically how I came to be interested into secret warfare.
And that led, of course, to this research into Gladio itself. Now, how easy did you actually find that to research? Did you find that governments were open in revealing their information?
It was really my interest which guided my steps. I tried to first establish whether it's a fact that NATO had secret armies, and I went back to the records and I looked at the resolution of the European Parliament. I have it right here, right now. It's from 22 November 1990, and it says, "The European Union Parliament protests vigorously at the assumption by certain US military personnel at SHAPE, SHAPE is the Supreme Headquarters Allied Power Europe, and in NATO, of the right to encourage the establishment in Europe of a clandestine intelligence and operations network." And so I said, okay, there's a secret network in Europe, and the European Union protests, against NATO, and NATO doesn't want to reply. So it was a fight between the big guys, the European Union being a big guy and NATO being a big guy, and somewhere there was a quarrel. So I thought, yeah, this is really interesting. And then I went further into the details, and I found out that the Italian Prime Minister, Giulio Andreotti, had confirmed that a secret army existed in Italy. And it was very funny because at the time, the French president was François Mitterrand. He said, no, we didn't have a secret army. And then the Italian Prime Minister, Giulio Andreotti, said, oh, yes, very much so. I mean, there was a meeting in 1990, and also the French attended that meeting. And so Paris was really, embarrassed, because then they had to confirm that, what they had said the previous day was actually wrong, and that, in fact, they had a stay-behind army. And so it was a scandal which was out of control. Every country tried to comment, and by commenting in one direction, they were corrected by another country. And so in the end, I had enough data which absolutely solidly and beyond any doubt confirmed that NATO had a secret army. And in Italy, it was called Gladio. In other countries, it was called Stay Behind.
But I can imagine that must have been really difficult for you to pick through all the claims and the counterclaims and the propaganda and actually decide what's the truth in this. Anyway, what I want to ask you to do first really is to kind of set out what Gladio is, because I quite suspect that many people will know what it is or what it was, but there will be some people who've never heard about it before, I'm quite sure. So perhaps it'd be a good idea just to state basically what it was. Could you give us an idea?
Yes, sure. Gladio is actually the word for a short sword. So the gladiators in ancient Rome used that double-edged sword. It's actually the name for a weapon, gladio. And in Italy, during the Cold War, you had an Italian military secret service called the Servizio Informazioni Sicurezza Militare. So that's just the military secret service. And this secret service had a branch, so it's part of the Italian Secret Service, which was called Gladio. So it was a top secret part of the Italian Secret Service, which was preparing to fight for two things, and that's where it becomes really delicate. One, in case of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, so an invasion of Italy, of France, of Germany, of Denmark, etc., of Norway, Switzerland, this secret network of soldiers would have fought as a guerrilla army, in the sense, that they fight behind enemy lines. They would have their arms caches with explosives, with weapons, with ammunition, and also with communication gear. So, in the case that you had NATO pilots shot down above Soviet-occupied France, you would have the NATO secret army guerrillas giving information to governments abroad, probably in UK or in US, unoccupied territory, about the shot down pilots. So, it was very much along this idea of resistance. That was one branch.
So it was actually inspired by the resistance movements in World War II, was it?
That's true, very much so. In fact, I've had a few people in Norway who said, we don't want to be called gladiators, and we don't want to be called secret soldiers, because that all has this touch of that we were somehow linked to acts of terrorism that try to destabilize the European democracies. In fact, we did the opposite. We were occupied by the Germans during World War II. And when World War II was over in 1945, our aim was to prepare for a new war. And that would have been the war against the Soviet Union. And in order to be really ready for that war, we did not only have a regular army, so the soldiers that are controlled by the defense department, but we also had a second, like a secret group, which would fight even when the normal army would have declared defeat. So we were resistance fighters, and we were doing this very honorable job. And, I believe that part of the NATO secret army covered people who were in no way extremists, but who just wanted to defend their country in case it would have been occupied. And so we can't lump them all together, and it's important to keep these two things apart.
Absolutely. So how many countries were actually involved in having these stay-behind armies?
Oh, many countries. The scandal broke in Italy, and first it was believed that it's just another Italian mess, so to speak, because there's always a scandal in Italy, isn't there? And
Right.
but then, it went further. The defense minister from Belgium at the time was in Italy, and, he read in the paper that also Belgium had a secret army, and he thought, gee, that's interesting. I'm the defense minister and I've never heard of it. And so he flew back to Belgium, and he called his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so the highest officer of the Belgian military, and he asked him, is it true what the Italian newspaper writes, that we have a secret army also in Belgium? And then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Belgium said, yeah, that's true. And then the defense minister said, wait, that's a bit strange. Why don't I know nothing about it? I'm the defense minister. And then the military officer said, we are military officers, and we dedicate basically our entire career, our whole life to military affairs. And you're just the defense minister, and a socialist further on, so governments come and go, and we're not going to tell every defense minister about the more secret operations that we have ongoing. And, it went on that the Belgian parliament then made an investigation, and in Belgium you had the same structure. It was also part of the secret service, and within the secret service you had the secret army. And it was not only Italy and Belgium, it was also in Switzerland that we had a secret army. It was also in Germany that you had a secret stay-behind army. You had one in the Netherlands, you had one in Denmark, another one in Norway, then also in Spain and in Portugal, furthermore in Greece and in Turkey. And you also had one in Finland. Neutral Finland was not part of NATO at the time and still isn't today. Also in Austria, another neutral country, and in Sweden. So basically what you can say is that all of Western Europe was covered with a network of NATO stay-behind armies, which were designed to become operative in the case of a Soviet invasion. Obviously, now we know today that the Soviet invasion never came, but at the time when these networks were set up, so in the late 40s and the early 50s, people weren't so sure.
Yeah. And you say that certain politicians, certain ministers were given information that these stay-behind armies existed, but many of them weren't. How was that decision made?
I think the fear of NATO, the fear of Washington, and also the fear of London was that if you give this information to a socialist minister or even a communist minister, a minister of the Interior, a minister of Defense, prime minister, whatever, then, the secret might be passed on to Moscow. So to speak, NATO did not trust all European governments to handle this secret in the sense that, you could actually tell Parliament or that you could tell the press, because strictly speaking, in a democracy, you can't have a secret army. Okay, it's totally illegal. You can't. You can have a police force, you can have a secret service, and you can have an army. These are the three forces that are designed to guarantee security. But Parliament, which represents the population, must know who is in the defense forces, who is in the secret service. The parliamentarians must be able to know every name of every police officer carrying a weapon. And it's impossible that Parliament does not know about an entire network of secret armies. But in fact, that was the case. So we actually have here a failure of democratic control. And I looked at it specifically here in Switzerland. The reason was that they didn't tell parliamentarians because